Although Thalen and other hip merchants suffered from cognitive dissonance relative to their business's success, there emerged in the Haight, by 1966, a group of unabashed, flamboyant hippie radicals, the Diggers, who were uncompromising in their belief that property, land, money, ownership of anything was theft, and thus everything should be free. All goods, all services, love, behaviour, relationships. Indeed, the Diggers' motto was free, and the most apt term for their ideas and behaviour was anarchism, albeit a proclaimed socially conscious and responsible type of insurgency, but subversion nonetheless of the liberal capitalist system. They were anarchists of the deed, and their outrageous antics and flair for the theatrical was to carry a romantic idea to its logical endpoint, the realization of a completely free society. According to ex-digger David Simpson, we were like a street gang, and we really believed the socio-economic structure of America was completely unsustainable. We were trying to build a new, free society in the shell of the old. The Diggers despised the 1960s establishment liberal ethos, as embodied in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and the bourgeois culture that supported it, declaring that such a system was beyond reformation. They believed that their mission in the Haight-Ashbury was to begin the uprising, to liberate humanity from the money nexus that presently had captured the hearts and minds of the majority of white Americans, moulding them into self-centered, acquisitive, and hostile human beings. Their goal was to transform the Haight-Ashbury into an autonomous community where people took care of each other and lived by their own visions, eschewing the profit motive poisoning America. To many in the Haight, the Diggers became the prime model of organised love. For their various digger papers, typed, anonymous, mimeographed manifestos put up on telephone poles, in storefronts, on walls, and even on door fronts throughout the Haight-Ashbury, the Diggers declared that their existence was to, quote, help motivate youth who move about without direction, to discover the rich creative potential inherent in them, and to establish positive, goal-directed activities for themselves, unquote. Another Digger decree announced that every brother should have what he needs to do his own thing. Also, since the United States had become a society beyond scarcity, it was time to live off the abundant fat of the land, or in the words of a Digger leaflet, sow the rags of surplus into teepees. There should even be free families for every individual or group who desired to form such kinship, whether they were the Black Panthers or radical street gangs, homosexuals, communards, whomever, regardless of their orientation. Such associations, the Diggers believed, would become the vanguard for the free cities, where everything that is necessary can be obtained for free by those involved in the various activities of the various clans. For a while, the Diggers were one of the counterculture's most productive and fantastic communities. Unlike the tens and thousands of young people who would soon appear in the neighbourhood, they had not run away to the Haight, but rather believed that it was in that locale, at that specific moment, that they were to ignite the cultural and spiritual revolution the hippies represented. In fact, the Diggers had the most thoroughly conceived conscious ideology of any group in the Haight, a hybrid of bohemian New Left politics filtered through psychedelic eyes. For a brief moment in the 1960s, the Diggers became one of the most legendary avant-garde collectives in American history. Their principal founders, Emmett Grogan, Peter Berg, Peter Coyote, and Bill Murcott, had immersed themselves in the Haight's growing drug scene, sharing with the hippie faithful the belief that acid was the key to liberating individuals from the bourgeois trips that had been laid on young Americans by their parents, teachers, and all other human and institutional forms and manifestations of authority, restraint, and conformity. It was during an LSD trip that Grogan had a flash of illumination that property was theft, and therefore it was his and his followers' responsibility to Haight residents, and to all others who came to Ashbury seeking liberation, to have what they needed for free. Grogan and company took the name diggers from the 17th century English social dissenters, who appropriated common land and gave their surplus to the poor during Cromwell's reign. Although claiming to speak for the Haight's true hip community, more often than not, the diggers' messages fell on deaf ears. Their leaflets were frequently too intellectually sophisticated for the majority of Ashbury hippies to mentally digest or act upon. Part of the diggers' engrossing presence on Ashbury streets was the literary, theatrical way they implemented their ideas and challenged the establishment. All of its founding members had been professional street actors with the legendary San Francisco Mime Troupe, founded in 1963 by Ron Davis, who had performed radical plays for free in public venues several years before the first hippie appeared on the Haight's boulevards. From the Mime Troupe's inception in 1959, Davis's goal was to use his company to push American society beyond what he called the stagnation of the 50s. Davis found traditional bourgeois theatre to be mindless, formulaic escapism, and the agitprop plays of the old left, pedantic pseudo-realism. My own theatrical premise, wrote Davis, was that Western society is rotten in general, capitalist society in the main, and US society in particular. While still performing for the Mime Troupe, Digger co-founder Peter Berg coined the term guerrilla theatre, a concept Davis readily embraced and fanatically supported. It became the Mime Troupe's raison d'etre. Davis and Berg required every company member, in addition to being artistically innovative or gifted, to be politically oriented. The stage, wherever it may be, or in whatever shape it may come, must function as a weapon against establishment injustices and social inequities. The Mime Troupe and their counterculture compatriots across the creative spectrum viewed art holistically. That is, politics, art, and personal life were all components of an interactive movement aimed at transforming the way people lived. Art was politics by the 1960s, and this mantra became especially true for the performing arts, whose creators were knee-deep in raising consciousness. Their work's priority was to move rather than entertain the audience. Every performance was designed to affect their audience's lives profoundly, and in the process, to express the joy of it all. The purpose required a special kind of actor, and Davis had some types in mind. I personally like to work with the kooks, the emotionally disturbed, the violent ones, the fallen away Catholics, non-Jewish Jews, the deviates. They do what the well-trained actor can never do. They create. Thus, throughout the country, an array of small, ephemeral street drama groups appeared in college towns and metropolitan centres, all of whom embraced Berg's approach and methods. Their shows attacked racism, the Vietnam War, and establishment hypocrisy and abuse of the people. Their goal was to help individuals to liberate themselves from the bourgeoisie's psychological hang-ups about sex, materialism, and conformity. It was out of this rich compost of left politics, pot, LSD, and free love that the diggers emerged, a ragtag of street activists and cultural anarchists who would set much of the tone for the countercultural capital. Just as Davis had split from the Actors' Workshop for his colleagues' alleged sellout to the establishment, so were the diggers' founders motivated to bolt from the San Francisco Mime Troupe when Davis refused to take his activism to where it counted, directly to the people on the streets. Ashbury's flowing, turbulent streets were the perfect venue for activist theatre, preferred to the auditoriums and parks where the Mime Troupe usually performed. During the summer of 1966, Grogan decided it was time to provide the Haight with some politics, and thus he and his compatriots began issuing anonymous mimeographed essays, and putting up posters and signs throughout the neighbourhood, all expressing the group's anarchist philosophy and all signed Digger. Thus was born the Digger Papers. Grogan and company spared no one in their attacks on Haight-Ashbury culture and its followers. They were particularly vituperative in their assault on the Phelan brothers and the other HIP, the Haight Independent Proprietors, a consortium formed in early 1906 of the community's countercultural shopkeepers, merchants for their profiteering off the hippie fad, prettified monsters of money lust. The Digger Papers also condemned the hip Oracle for its pansiness, while labelling the paper an old rag of misinformation, outdated news, psychedelic bullshit art, and pre-masticated verbal masturbation about what we already know. Although the Diggers may have dismissed the Oracle as the mouthpiece of hip and of the Haight establishment, the paper nonetheless was mostly apolitical and documented the neighbourhood's philosophy and culture with beautiful graphics, poems, and articles written by prominent underground members. According to founder Alan Cohen, the paper's main objective was to expose the mainstream's print press as a lie. We were going to make the newspaper format a joke that would show everyone that conventional newspapers were destroying sensibilities, causing paranoia and fear. We were going to fill our newspaper with art, philosophy, poetry, and attend to this change of consciousness that was happening in the Haight-Ashbury, and we hoped, the world. Despite the Diggers' assault, the Oracle was popular with more than just the Ashbury's hippie population. At its peak, circa summer 1967, the paper had a circulation of 117,000 and boasted worldwide distribution, establishing its legacy as one of the largest community underground journals ever printed. Its avant-garde graphic style and printing methods set the standards of graphic excellence for all underground papers to follow, and which were later co-opted by such mainstream publications as Vogue and Playboy. As noted British journalist and underground press pathfinder John Wilcock observed of the Oracle, its creators used colour the way Lautrec must have experimented with lithography, testing the resources of the medium to the utmost and producing what almost any experienced newspaperman would tell you was impossible. It is a creative dynamo whose influence will undoubtedly change the look of American publishing. Most important, the Oracle provided a venue through which the community's residents could feel comfortable expressing views not publishable in the mainstream media, giving more insightful and usually more accurate detailed accounts of hippie happenings than the established press. Mainstream reporters simply did not have intimate access to such events, and their jaundiced conventional reporting could not match the authentic insider's view of the hippie community and how its members interpreted their complicated relationship with the dominant culture. The Diggers also saw fit to disparage the New Left, referring to its leaders as self-righteous and as full of puritanical shit, as the country's right wing was cowardly absurd. New leftists were creep commies on power trips. Leary's drug culture was naive and devoid of moral direction. The Diggers even lambasted the rock stars they hung out with for being people who can sing about the evils of the world while margining profits into war economies and maintaining their comforts on a consumer level of luxury. Grogan and company believed that most hippies were cute, unserious, and innocent, white kids who weren't that hip. Indeed, the Diggers believed the hippie idea that love, peace, and a smile, along with a chest full of buttons and a psychedelic shop, was all that was needed to transform the world, was just as much bullshit as the Swami's transcendental meditation. In a street manifesto titled Sheep, Ba, the Diggers warned hippies to beware of leaders, heroes and organisers. Any man who wants to lead you is the man. Think, why would anyone want to lead me? Fuck leaders. When love does its thing, they declared in a broadside, it does it for itself, not for profit. To show love is to fail. The diggers were either or. If you're not a digger, you're property. If you really believe it, do it. Suffice to say, the Thalen brothers and the other hip businessmen did not take kindly to the diggers' verbal pummeling, and thus began the chronic war between the anarchists and the Haight merchants that agitated the neighbourhood to the end of hippiedom in San Francisco. As Oracle co-founder Alan Cohen remembered, the diggers had a tendency towards anarchy that bordered on violence. The Haight merchants, in defence against the diggers' demand to share their profits with the community, accused them of extortion and violence. In-gear owner Tvi Strauch was even more direct in her condemnation of the diggers' radical Marxist approach to capitalism. See, they believe in purity, which doesn't exist in the world, but dogmatic ideologies always claim to have that kind of purity, like Catholics and the communists and logical positivists. They interpret the Haight-Ashbury according to their own economic doctrines without any real knowledge of what's going on. So they claim that we're selling love and that we're dressing like hippies to sell our thing. We're not straight people who saw something good, grew a quick beard, opened a store, and are trying to capitalize on that. You're not forced to buy anywhere. That's just Marxist bullshit. One of the diggers' more participatory demonstrations was their September 1966 street happening, to begin at dusk, at which time hundreds of hippies shined rear-view mirrors the diggers had liberated from a local junkyard from Haight Street rooftops into the eyes of drivers going up the street to reflect the sunset. A group of women simultaneously began chanting on the street below, and soon were joined by thousands of other street folk who joined in the chorus. The police, of course, showed up, and they began clearing the crowds. They unwittingly became part of the show. This was just one of the diggers' many theatrical public capers, all of which were designed to be rituals of release through spirit, with crowds of people pouring into the streets. To the diggers, action, not words, counted, and thus the need for perpetual, outrageous, poignant street theatre, for such visual, physical displays of artistic expression, could alter consciousness by altering frames of reference. In October 1966, the diggers began handing out leaflets announcing that every day at 4 p.m. at the panhandle of Ashbury Street, free food would be distributed to all who came. So bring a bowl and spoon. Every day for the next year, the diggers made good their word. By the time the diggers began their free food crusade, the Haight was beginning to fill up with teenage refugees from suburbia, many of whom were dead broke, and thus they flocked to the diggers' free feedings. The victuals weren't entirely free. Those who wanted food first had to walk through a large wooden frame painted yellow, called the Free Frame of Reference. Their passage through the portal signified their supposed liberation from materialism. The quality of food was unpredictable, even suspect at times, but to hungry street urchins, a hot bowl of soup of mysterious ingredients, complemented with 2-day-old sourdough, went far to soothe a growling empty stomach. The meat was usually fresh, although it was mostly butcher shop trimmings or chicken wings. The vegetables were often wilted, but in soups that made little difference. Most of the food was either begged or donated. Some was just lifted. Digger cook Phyllis Wilner was just a 16-year-old runaway from New York when she arrived in Ashbury in 1966, broke and hungry. She remembered being fed by the diggers. Each week, Phil, at the chicken warehouse, was good for 2 cases of chicken wings. Ray, at the fish dock, provided a box of fish, and so it went. One day we received a message from a marine biologist from the Fish and Game Department, offering a whale that had been illegally caught by some fishermen. The carcass had been stripped and the meat filled our Dodge truck. We pounded the shit out of that meat, but it wasn't bad at all. It was okay and lasted a long time. As reflected in Phyllis Wilner's account, digger women did the grunt work that kept the movement alive, while the digger men had all the fun thinking up and staging all the pranks and spectacles. Rare was the moment when one could see Emmett Grogan or Peter Berg up at 5 a.m, driving the old truck around town, scrounging for food for the day's free meal at the Panhandle. Digger women not only procured the meat, vegetables and bread, but they also did all the cooking, lugged the food out to the Panhandle in massive steel milk containers and distributed to the hungry hordes. In addition to feeding the masses, digger women made all manner of clothing, often sewing for hours on end, and invented tie-dyeing methods of textile design, an innovation for which they never received proper recognition. As Emmett Grogan confessed years later, "If it hadn't been for these women, there wouldn't have been the 4 p.m. free food in the park every day, or any day. They were the real strength in the Haight-Ashbury community, the real diggers. Cooking 2 or 3 20-gallon milk canfuls of stew for 200 people can be a goof if you do it once a year, but try doing it for 2 or 3 days in a row, for 2 or 3 weeks, for 2 or 3 months, and not getting paid, not to make any money from it at all. It's a bitch." As was the more prevalent than not throughout the counterculture, hippie women were treated as less than equals, relegated and confined to traditional roles, and often ridiculed and condemned when trying to establish their autonomy and self-actualization through a movement that allegedly cherished individual freedom. Running through the counterculture from beginning to end was an oppressive, sexually charged male chauvinism and dominance that blatantly contradicted the hippie message and belief in the freedom and equality of all humanity. The diggers topped their free food jape by opening a free store in a converted garage on Page Street. They called their emporium the Free Frame of Reference, and after they were forced to move from their original locale, they named their new place the Trip Without a Ticket. At either location, anybody could rummage through boxes and barrels for clothes, pots, dishes and food. The store reflected the diggers' contempt for all things the straight world held dear. When liberals gave money, the diggers burned it. When someone asked who was in charge, he was told he was. As Michael William Doyle has observed, all of the diggers' free ventures parodied capitalism, even while redistributing the cornucopian bounty of the system surplus. The media loved the diggers and portrayed them as a hip version of the Salvation Army. Indeed, as New York East Village digger leader Abby Hoffman declared, diggers were hippies who had learned to manipulate the media instead of being machinated by them. A modern revolutionary group, Hoffman explained, headed for the television station, not the factory. Interestingly, Hoffman also believed that both groups are in one sense a huge put-on. The diggers' exploits and escapades quickly gained national attention. Flocks of imitators appeared, not just throughout the Bay Area and in Southern California, but nationwide. All the digger groups pursued the same agenda: displays of public contempt for the bourgeois capitalist liberal ethos, and the use of street theatrics not only to promote their philosophy of free and win converts, but to defy all of manifestations of establishment authority. They were the artist politicians who the avant-garde had long envisioned. Although disdainful of the hippie ethos, the diggers nonetheless felt compelled to inspire as many flower children as they possibly could to explore alternative consciousness by experimenting with new forms of social relationships. The diggers embraced the use of hallucinogenic drugs, which they believed helped individuals to try on new costumes and to seek new identities. Freedom, to the diggers, meant to not be afraid to act in front of others, of doing your own thing, free of all inhibitions and restraints. They encouraged public displays of private desires and fantasies, which they believed represented the self-revelation of the totally free and autonomous person, unleashed from all social controls imposed by a spiritually suffocating American culture. As would occur with many of the counterculture's dreams and crusades for a better world, free from obsessions about money, career, and pursuit of the American dream, reality would soon obtrude upon and shatter their illusions about humanity, especially the willingness of the poor, the degraded, the radicalized, and the racialized and the marginalized to embrace their ideals. Such was the rude awakening digger newbie Alex Foreman experienced while working in the Diggers' Free Store. Foreman realized the absurdity of what the diggers were trying to do when a group of older black women came into the emporium and asked, "How much do these clothes cost here?" We said, "Oh, it's all free. You just take what you need, and then if you have extra, you give." They said, "What do you mean you just take what you need?" "Well, you just take what you need, that's all." They said, "Really?" So they came back with these big boxes and just started taking tons of stuff off the racks. We said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Well, you said take what you need." We said, "Yeah, well, you don't need all those clothes for yourself." They said, "No, but we need the money, so we're going to take all the clothes and sell them." Peter Coyote had a similar experience on the day he was the Free Store's manager. One day I noticed an obviously poor black woman furtively stuffing clothing into a large paper bag. When I approached her, she turned away the bag coolly, pretending it wasn't hers. In a conventional store, her ruse would have made sense, because she knew she was stealing. Smiling pleasantly, I returned the bag to her. "You can't steal here," I said. She got indignant and said, "I wasn't stealing." "I know," I said amiably, "but you thought you were stealing. You can't steal here because it's a free store. Read the sign. Everything is free. You can have the whole fucking store if you feel like it. You can take over and tell me to get lost." Such encounters led Foreman, Coyote, and others to the realization that the outside of the rarefied confines of Haight-Ashbury, and even within its environs, not all of its citizens had become enlightened seekers who could afford or were willing to extend such generosity to others. That scarcity, not abundance, was the order of the day for many Americans, particularly for African Americans and other socio-economically marginalized groups. Foreman had bought into the anti-money thing, expressed by Ron Palin, Guy Straight, and the Diggers, and thus naively, yet sincerely, believed such redemption possible. However, the black women and the other poor neighbourhood folk who undoubtedly frequented the store as often as possible and saw such bounty as manna from heaven for their own personal benefit gave Foreman a dose of the harsh reality for many of his neighbours. They needed money, and here we were just saying take what you need for your own personal immediate needs, but for them that wasn't reality. Their reality was, how are you going to get some money? And here's these foolish white people just letting us take whatever we need. Well, we need it all. We don't have anything. Although determined to change consciousness by an anarcho-theatrical artistic approach, the Diggers' philanthropy and altruism should not be misunderstood as hippie goodwill industries project. There was a darker underside to the Diggers, both personally and philosophically. They were significantly older than the majority of the hippies and radicals they associated with or tried to inspire. Many of them had run-ins with the law, such as former junkie Emmett Grogan, who some have labelled a sinister, paranoid, secretive and often violent character. Even Peter Berg, who worshipped Grogan, admitted that he, Grogan, was a little bit sociopathic towards other people. He even stole stuff from me. To the Diggers, free was not about genuine charity, but rather a tactic in the long political struggle to destroy the straight world's bourgeois capitalist system and replace it with an anarchist culture, which would not only liberate the human spirit, but allow it to flourish to its fullest potential as well. However, The Diggers' often aggressive, confrontational style, hatred of all rules and convention, and their recklessness, all in the name of freedom, riled the Haight-Ashbury. Indeed, many of the Haight's original hippie denizens denounced the Digger creed and the Diggers' willingness to purposely provoke the city's establishment, the police, politicians, and all straights, into acts of repression. The Diggers' anarchistic philosophy and refusal to accommodate any manifestations of normal society was antithetical to the hippie message of peace, love, and the brotherhood of all humanity, and the respect for each person to be able to do their own thing. Many hippies worried that the Diggers' outrageous antics and acts of deviance would give all hippies a bad rap, and that straights would associate all hippies with the Diggers and believe that within every hippie lurked a dangerous and sinister political radical who was out to subvert, with violence if necessary, traditional American society and culture. Thus, many hippies disassociated themselves from the Diggers, fearing any affiliation would provoke further straight disdain for their movement. Although only a handful of hippies joined the Diggers, they nonetheless had their partisans. One such admirer was a Yippie co-founder, Abbie Hoffman, who described them as slum alley saints, who lit up the period by spreading the poetry of love and anarchy with broad strokes of artistic genius. Despite the tensions already present in the Haight among many of the neighbourhood's different groups, the overall population continued to grow throughout 1966 and into 1967. For Alex Foreman, who arrived in the Haight in 1966, the city was just exploding with this counterculture movement. I thought, this is it. It was like paradise there. Everyone was in love with life and in love with their fellow human beings, to the point where they were just sharing in incredible ways with everyone. Taking people in the streets and letting them stay in their homes, breaking free of conventional morality. When walking down the neighbourhood streets, people would smile at you and just go, "Hey, it's beautiful, isn't it?" It was like people were high in the street and willing to share that energy. It was a very special time. It was a whole other vision of what was possible. Such was also the experience and sentiments of native Indianan Larry Hootchin, who left Los Angeles for the Haight-Ashbury in 1966. Upon arrival, he too was overwhelmed by how friendly, loving, sharing, and just high on life everyone was. I had never felt so welcomed by strangers. Hootchin had saved up some money and was able to rent a 6-bedroom, 4-bath, 3-level Victorian home, complete with a huge playroom, for $200 a month. Hootchin rented out rooms to all manner of individuals over the course of the next 3 years, prior to the Summer of Love. Hootchin loved all the people I rented to. They were real hippies, committed to what they believed in, and lived by their philosophy as well. I never had any problems. Hootchin also embraced the hippies' sexual liberation credo, in which he fully participated, to the degree that he not only balled a lot of different girls who were just hanging out at my pad with nothing better to do, but also from whom I got a whole series of bad crabs, but eventually really bad, painful, drippy dick, that I had to go to the doctor for shots in medicine, penicillin. Man, no one wanted to use rubbers in those days. No protection needed, we thought. All the girls were on the pill. It was also at this time that Hootchin began to immerse himself in the drug scene, which in retrospect he believed caused the Haight's ultimate downfall, as well as his own. I fried my brain pretty good then, and now I have a hard time remembering recent shit or just staying focused very long. But at the time, man, it was great. Marijuana was everywhere and cheap, and acid was too. I began to deal in both and made pretty good money. But you didn't need a lot back then. Everything was pretty cheap. I liked acid a lot more than weed. I had taken hundreds of trips by the time I was in the B-in. Fuck everything else, I said. Job, career, money. There was plenty of dope for everyone, and everyone loved each other. No hang-ups here. I wanted to stay in San Francisco forever. As reflected in Houchin's comments, the key to such early bliss in the Haight, and the main reason why the neighbourhood was not simply North Beach transplanted, was LSD. Indeed, LSD became the Haight's best-kept secret for euphoria. As one of the community's early initiates remembered, taking it was like being in a secret society. Hardly anything was being said about it publicly, and although not an illegal drug, people acted as if it were. It seemed illegal. No doubt the majority of the Haight-Ashbury's original hippie habitants shared Houchin's and Foreman's sentiments, and would continue to do so up until the Summer of Love, which began in June 1967. Unfortunately, by the time the summer ended, the event had shattered the illusions about the neighbourhood and the counterculture in general, held by Houchin, Foreman, and many of the Haight-Ashbury's original hippie founders. However, until that time, the Haight's hippies revelled in their moment in the sun, especially in their freedom to pursue Dionysian ecstasies, both bodily and mystic.